I'm very pleased that Heather Everett is able to be here with us tonight. Am I pronouncing your name correctly?
Yes.
Okay. Heather is certified by the Japan Tamari Association, and she's going to demonstrate for us the Japanese folk craft of Temari. So take it away, Heather.
Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for joining in the workshop virtually today. It's great to see a nice turnout of folks who are curious about this. And I really wanted to say thank you to Megan and to the Aurora Library for reaching out and inviting me to share a little part of Japanese culture during the week here when the Olympics are going on in Tokyo. And again, my name is Heather Everett, and I live in Bloomington Normal, in Bloomington actually. And my connection to Japanese Temari, it started with a library book, which makes me feel extra good about doing demos for libraries and doing classes at libraries, because the library is where I found out what a Temari was. And I decided that I had to take the book home and learn how to do it. And through being privileged to be in the internet age, then I was also able to find a teacher who could help me out remotely, and found the Japan Tamari Association, found other Tamari makers. I've got there's lots of design ideas and instructional videos out there on the internet. My teacher is Barbara Cease, and she is in North Carolina, and she's top 4th level certified in the Japan Tamari Association as a designer and teacher. And I have a 1st level certification. I'm working right now on a 2nd level certification, which includes drawing designs of one's own Tamari, in addition to the technical work. And I do design my own Tamari, often based on plant life here in the middle of Illinois. I also do other types of embroidery, 2D also, and I make Tamari on commission. I teach classes in person at the McLean County Art Center in Bloomington. And I also have been known to teach at the public libraries here in Bloomington and in Normal. What I want to start out with today is a little introduction to what is a Tamari. So you'll get a chance to see a lot of pictures of different types of patterns, and I'll tell a little bit about the history of where Tamari comes from, what kind of significance it has in Japan. And then during the part where I'll be showing live what my hands are doing when I'm starting to make a Tamari, that'll be a time when I can have Megan check the chats and I can answer questions while stitching live. And so if you do have a question, whether you're on Facebook or on Zoom, please use the chat to type in your question, and then I'll let you all know when the right time is that I'll start answering them. So first thing to do here is I'm going to share the screen and show a few slides with all the pretty pictures of some of my work and a couple from a couple of different artists, and talk a little bit about background of Tamari. And I'll view this as this is a full screen. Here we go. The Tamari that you are seeing here are some of my own work. They are one of the classic styles of Tamari. The pattern here is called a chrysanthemum pattern. It looks like a flower. And this is mirrored on the ball, so you can see one half of it, and then the exact same pattern is repeated on the other side of the ball as well. So here's a couple other close-ups of this classic pattern with the chrysanthemum style. These are a style that is wrapped bands. So instead of stitches that you can see at the corners, like in the kiku here, these bands go all the way around the ball. And the way that they interact with each other when they crisscross is part of the appeal of using wrapped bands. These also often show up in other tamari that have part on top, part on bottom, or I should say on the same thing on the bottom, as a belt in between the two. And those wrapped bands that are kind of in the middle of the ball are called an obi, and that is the Japanese word for a belt worn with kimono, right at the center of the human being, just like that band is at the center, on the sort of equator line of the little planet that is a tamari ball. These are some patterns that are solid shapes and also some interlocking open shapes. At the top right is it's an example of using 6-point intersections to start making a 5-pointed Japanese maple leaf with a stem. And there's also a little bit of free embroidery going on in between the larger leaves. And sometimes people will cover an entire tamari ball with free embroidery that doesn't really seem to follow any specific guidelines, and sizes of the shapes may vary depending on the whim of the stitcher. In the bottom right are some diamonds that are an obi for one of the tamari that you can see behind me. And then on the left, these are 3 interlocking shapes. You can see some sort of elongated ovals and also an open square. There's also other patterns that use continuous paths. So once you start at one point, make the stitches in a certain sequence all the way around the ball. And as those rows of stitching layer up, they can create their own shapes, such as the one on the right. That shape is called Mitsubishi. It's a 3-pointed or 3-diamond triangle. And the logo for that car company also is a 3-diamond triangle. That's where they got the name. And then flax stitching is the blue part of this ball on the left, where the white lines are continuous paths that are between the sort of stars that are in blue. And it's supposed to be reminiscent of the leaf of a flax plant. And there are more really great advanced works of tamari to see at these 2 websites. And when this presentation is over, I'll make sure to copy and paste these into the chat. And then let's talk, or before I move on, I just wanted to let people know that the JapaneseTamari.com, that is the website for my teacher, Barbara Cease. So a little bit about the history of tamari. Where do they come from? Why and how did people start doing this? It's pretty commonly believed, because the people who really know exactly what happened didn't happen to write it down at the time. Possibly 1,000 years ago, the idea of making a ball with wrapped and stitched leather for kicking around, a Temari or a foot mari ball, came to Japan from China. And once people had this plaything, then there got to be some ideas about, well, what else can we do with this when we have other kinds of threads that we could use to make even prettier balls. I'm not exactly certain when people started making the more artistic patterns. The earliest that I've ever seen any pictures that are painted of tamari are from the Edo era Japan. So that is starting in the 17th century. It's also called Tokugawa period. The the origin for why this artistic object came around is one or the other or both. We're not really certain whether the inspiration for Tamari was entirely based at the imperial court, or if people who were like the lowest of the low, laundresses, when you have to wash a kimono, you actually have to unsew it. So pick out all the stitches, wash the separate rectangles of fabric, and then stitch them back together. And if a few threads here and there fell off or got snagged during the laundering, perhaps those people who were doing the laundry grabbed a rock or a shell or something to wrap some of those pretty threads around and use later for making something beautiful to give as a gift. We know for sure that one of the uses for Tamari at imperial court was to toss back and forth, and that went along with songs or chants, sort of like how you would hear kids who are playing jump rope. They have little sing-songy chants to go with it. And then with the silk that comes from unpicking a kimono or taking all the threads that are still usable out of a worn out kimono to do the decorative stitching. These objects were ones where one could compete with other stitchers to see who had, the most technical prowess at making beautiful designs. When cotton arrived as an available thread in Japan in the 19th century, that is when Temari really were very, very common, done by mothers to give to their children as things to play with. If you wrap a Temari tight enough, it can bounce a little bit. And if it's made of cheaper cotton thread, you don't feel so bad if it gets a little bit dirty while it's being played with. Then at the same time, the developments are going on with embroidery, with silk threads and other expensive metallics, to have less of a thing to play with and more of a thing to hang or display on a pillow or a stand to look at. During the early part of the 20th century, and especially after World War II, there was a bit of a falling back of interest in the art. There weren't as many people who were doing it into the late 20th century. In the 1960s, there was a mother and daughter duo who published the first book of instructions for Temari so that they could show other people how to make them. And that book and others that followed did lead to a real resurgence in the art in the 1970s and onward. In the 1970s, the Japan Temari Association was created, and that association is interested in certifying artists who have shown a certain level of skill in Temari, to promote the teaching of Temari to new people, and to just promote having them available for display in as many places around the world as possible. Why we make them now? First and foremost, one of the oldest and ongoing uses for a Temari is as a gift for somebody who's very special for you. One might make a Temari thinking about who the recipient is going to be. And while wrapping threads around the ball, think, happy thoughts, think good wishes, think wishes for good luck for the person that's going to receive it. I have also heard about the possibility that some Temari artists of old even included a written piece of paper with a prayer for the person who'd be receiving that Temari ball. These are also very common for parents to give to their children if they get married. Also for parents to give their children at the new year. So that'd be the lunar new year that's in winter or early spring. And also to give when a child is born. and as the note says here, especially a female child. Although there are people of all genders learning Tamari currently in the 21st century, traditionally this has been really female-centered art, and women giving them to other women is a really common way of using a Tamari as a gift. There are also competitions that one can make Tamari to take your skill head to head with other artists. There are competitions that happen in Japan that some Americans have competed in. I happen to have the luck of meeting the person who won the last JTA competition in Japan last, let's see, that competition happened, I believe, in 2019, and I got to meet that person this summer who won the contest. You can also then, go on in trying to challenge yourself to always be doing something more difficult, to add on not only making the stitches, but also, learning how to teach to others, and just having a whole little garden of these small spheres that sort of look like blooming flowers when you get a bunch of them together can just add beauty and bring a little bit of outdoor color and detail indoors. One very common question that I get when I'm making Tamari out in public or displaying them is, what's inside? It is a layered sphere, and I really do start making it from the inside out. I also then, I'm using like a squishy sort of a stuffing, and if I want a Tamari that makes some noise, in the center of that squishy stuffing, I can put like a little container that has bells or other kind of noisemakers inside. You can also do like rice inside of a shell for starting as a base for wrapping the rest of the layers around. Or in my phrase here, shells, bells, and smells, you could also start with herbs or dried flowers to give it a nice scent. Then that squishy thing is pressed, hopefully equally from all sides, by yarn that is wrapped around it. And the outer layer, the one you can actually see, in this case in the Tamari that's here on the screen, it's the white background that you can see. That is sewing thread, and it's wrapped around, I don't even know how many hundreds of times to create the layer that the needle will actually be going into to make the stitches. And then to start in getting all of the symmetry right, we measure out guidelines, then add on using those lines either where they intersect or where they join at the top and the bottom, using those to guide where the stitches are going to go. And sometimes finishing includes having a decorative cord to hang it with, and sometimes also tassels. I do have a Tamari behind me here that is one that I did add some tassels to for decoration. And we don't always only have to pull apart a worn out Tamari, or sorry, pull apart a worn out kimono to make a Tamari here in the 21st century. The traditional fillings might include rice hulls. That's what you see in the photograph there behind the ball that I'm holding in the picture. Or you can use more modern things like those one-use plastic shopping bags to start a ball with. Or one author that I know of prefers to tell you how much stuffing to put into a nylon stocking, and then that will give you something that's holding on to squishy things that you can then wrap the yarn around and start the Tamari. As far as threads go, really common are pearl cotton. That's shiny because of a mercerizing process. It's applied thread that sort of looks a little bit more like a rope, but you can also use regular 6-stranded embroidery floss. Some people like to do that. I've also used wool threads in some of my Temari, and the sewing thread is, since you use a lot of it to make one ball, I usually go in for these cones of the serger sewing thread. And needles that I like to use are cotton darning needles. Hopefully the text is showing up not backwards for that. There are also specialty Temari needles that one can order from Japan. So far I'm just going with something that's more available locally. And for measuring, we use rulers or even just a strip of paper folded at certain spots around the circumference of the ball to guide where to put pins that will help know where to put the strings for the guidelines. And at this point, I'm going to switch over to the sort of overhand camera next to me here to show a little bit about starting out a Temari ball. And maybe I can check on whether there are questions in the chat that I should answer right away before starting on the live demo.
I don't currently see any questions,
All right.
But feel free to drop them in.
All right, I think I'm going to log out here with this. Okay, here I am in the meeting on the other device, and I don't have that awful reverb. So thanks for your patience with that, folks. This is a Temari that's all pinned up and ready for guidelines, but I want to go backwards just a little bit here.
Before you get started, I did have one question pop
sort of
up.
base, like a bag full of rice hulls. These I found at a brewing shop. And also, I have been known to use just like a piece of cloth filled with yarn scraps or cloth scraps from other things that I'm making here in the craft room. You could also use, poly fiber fill that people use for stuffing toys or pillows, and get that all, squished together and starting the wrapping process with some kind of soft yarn. And it doesn't matter if it's the cheapest thing around, because no one will see it. It'll be inside the ball, and you'll see that the wrapping on here is pretty random. So to keep pressure the same all the way around the ball when I'm doing the wrapping, I'm making sure to push in, pull it a little bit tightly, and move the ball frequently while I'm wrapping. After the yarn layer is finished, then it is time for a layer of sewing thread. And there's the one I'm looking for. That also gets wrapped around randomly while moving the ball around frequently. And so all the threads will get really, really crisscrossed all different directions until you have a finished ball like this. And this is the background color for starting off with a Temari pattern. Using a strip of just plain stiff paper, I've folded it in certain spots around the circumference of the Temari ball in order to, well, first off, I wrap the strip all the way around the ball to find out how large it actually is, and made a fold at the spot where that's the complete circumference. And then I can divide into fractions to find out where to put other guidelines, starting out with where to put the other pin for the exact opposite side of the ball. And in a lot of instruction books, these are referred to at, just like on a map, as North Pole and South Pole, just like if you had a globe. These pins that are around the middle are me setting up for what's going to be the equator or the obi. And for patterns where it's important for an all over pattern to have several other pins in other spots for creating a pattern that doesn't have a top and a bottom, but will be all over the ball, sometimes a little specialty ruler comes in handy for marking where to place those other pins so they'll be equally distant from each other. And I've got some thread here ready to go to start. What I'm going to do right now is to divide this ball into kind of 8 slices in a way. I'll be starting at the poles, going around the ball from pole to pole in order to get the kind of lines of longitude for my little globe. And then I'll head to the equator to make that line around the center of it. And that will be what's called a simple 8 division ball. And if there are some questions, just as I'm doing this part so you can see it, I can answer questions and stitch at the same time.
I did get one question. Can you hear me okay? Uh-oh, I may have lost, she may have lost the ability to hear me.
Heather, can you hear?
Well, I apologize. We may have to wait until she gets farther in the demonstration and switches back to the other device. But go ahead and submit. Go ahead and submit your questions.
You can see as I'm going along here that I'm really not putting the needle all the way through the ball. It's just a little bit under that thread layer. That's the outside wrapping there. Now, when I get to the end of a length of thread, grab my little scissors and pull on the thread while snipping very close to the ball, so that when I'm giving it that tension, then when the thread breaks from the scissors, the other little end of it will just sort of sink back down into the ball as the tension gets released. Grab myself some more thread here. What I'm ultimately aiming at is a ball that is divided into 8, like this sample is. The thread that I am using right now is cotton pearl, P-E-R-L-E, and it's on the thinner side. The pearl cottons are numbered, and the lower the number is, the thicker the thread is. It's numbered very similarly to wire, where the larger the number, the smaller the wire is. So I'm bringing my needle out right at the pin. getting threads stuck on pins is really common during this process. And also, if I were going to be displaying wrapping with sewing thread, I would probably also be dropping the ball a couple of times. That totally happens every time that almost every time that I do one of these. So I started at the South Pole with that one. I'm headed back up to the North Pole. And then I can make this a little easier on myself for the next one by just wrapping the string around the pin. All right, now I have this pole has 8 lines intersecting it, and so does this one. And if I really was going to do some serious stitching on this ball with a lot of tension, be making sure to tack down all those intersections as well. But I don't want to take lots and lots and lots of time just for that guideline part. Now I get to the pretty part. So do my little guidelines real quick, like at the equator, and start showing some actual stitching. I can hide a traveling piece of string by going right back in where the string came out. And there it goes. Now here I am at the equator. And when I get back to where I started, I'm just sinking the needle slightly into the ball and coming out somewhere else. I can sort of move things a little bit to get them all lined up properly with all those pins. And snip the thread. And you'll see me as I'm going along here, putting leftover threads into a little container that I can use then to make the next Tamari. Now I want to try another color of thread here and show a little bit of how to start with that very classic design called the kiku or chrysanthemum. The thread that I'm going to work with here, I don't know if the shine shows up quite so well on the zoom camera, but this is a silk floss that I have. It's a 2-plied type of a thread. So what I'm going to want to do while making this pole-centered flower pattern is be sure that all of my centers are equally distant from the pole, and all of the sort of end corners are equally distant from the equator. So I'll do a little bit of quick measuring here. It's a handy little paper strip that I pre-notched so I could use it to replace where the pins are. And this pattern goes, up high, then the next line over, down low, then up high again and down low. So I'm going to need all of my top pins to be equally distant from the pole. Or I should say every other. I'll start out with every other. And yeah, while I'm doing a little silent measuring here, have there been any questions that have come up? Maybe I can check the chat here. Do I start a new piece of thread the same way that I end one? Sort of. When starting a new piece of thread, I'm kind of starting somewhere and then coming out at an intersection or at a pin, and the end just kind of pulls into the inside of the ball. Some people are able to, some people are prefer to tie a knot and then pull the knot to the inside of the ball. My preference is a no knot method. How do I fix a mistake like tangling thread? Their patience, I guess I would say, is the watchword there. And if I don't have patience, I'll just end up cutting it. And then whatever end is still visible on the outside of the ball, just try to get that snipped as close as possible to the surface of the ball. And giving up and starting over is always an option. Pulling out all the stitches you've just done and starting over is a thing that does tend to happen a few different times during the process of making a Tamari, especially if it's a new type of pattern that I haven't done before, or it's something kind of complicated. And how many hours does it take to make an average size ball? Yeah, and prepping the core. Oh, there we go. I fixed the audio. I think I'll be able to hear Megan now. Sorry about that. That was my fault.
Can you hear me now?
I can, yes, thanks.
Okay, good.
So the one that I'm holding here, I guess for myself in my work, this is a pretty average sized ball. I also do sometimes on commission make very, very tiny balls. And those also work really great for selling as Christmas ornaments for Christmas trees. Or a person that I know from Japan uses them as little hangers on the zippers of her bags, just for something decorative to hold on to when she's trying to fumble around with the zipper. It's easier to grab the Tamari than it is to fumble around with the tiny little zipper pull. And I've also made some that are much, much larger, such as this ball here. So for comparison's sake. And I see a lot of balls where people really want to get very complex with an all over pattern. They will go as large as, you know, small volleyball or a small melon. That just leaves you more room to get more and more decorative stitching onto the ball. This sort of filling the hand-sized ball for wrapping it, starting at the core and getting all the way to the sewing thread on the outside, usually doesn't take too much longer than half an hour. And then depending upon how complicated the pattern is that I've chosen to stitch onto the ball, or how much measuring is involved before I even start making any stitches, I can be working on the same ball maybe a couple hours, several different days. I have had projects where you have an idea, you're partway through, something's missing, you don't figure out what it is until setting it aside for about 3 months and then come back to it. So I can finish the wrapping and the stitching and everything on one of the very, very small ones by just working continuously for about an afternoon. And then the much larger patterns just take longer for the number of times that the needle needs to go into the ball. So when I'm at the pins, making my corners of this shape, I'm really only grabbing just a few of the threads. Stick the needle in on slightly to one side of the pin, grab a couple of threads and make sure that I'm going under the guideline and then coming out. Part of making a Tamari look really neat and finished is trying to have these corners be as close to a 90-degree angle as possible. It does inevitably actually form a little bit of an X, but the closest that X can look to just being a corner is the ideal that we're all striving for. And now I have what's basically a 4-pointed star. And in order to go on and make the full 8-pointed star, then I would switch around at which point I'm going to the upper pin and lower pin. So I basically like flip-flop. So the pin distances on this line that's already been stitched would shift those around so that now this pin will be down here and the other pin will be up top that now is down below. And I will clip this thread here. And then once I've got the stitches are secured on the ball, I can remove the pins and they'll all stay where they were left. I do see there's one question that has come in here. I'll go to that. What store would you recommend for getting materials? Let's see. A lot of the things that I've been using for Tamari over the last several years, I've purchased at just an ordinary craft store, any place that has embroidery supplies, like Joanne is the one here in Bloomington that tends to have the biggest selection of embroidery threads. As far as the silk threads, that was something that I wasn't able to find locally, but there are sort of local thread stores in other cities where I can send away for mail order, and I just got a little stash of several different colors of silk threads from a shop out in New Jersey about a week ago. And I definitely recommend checking out sellers on either tamarikai.com or any suppliers that might be listed on JapaneseTamari.com that are able to provide supplies that are coming directly from Japan. And then they also have books that are published entirely in Japanese that one can order from Japan too. And then I also have had some really good luck sometimes with heading to garage sales and thrift stores to find yarns or extra embroidery threads that somebody donated before they used them all up, and you can get some very good prices by going in for, well, unused. You could say it's used because it's at the thrift store, but it hasn't actually been used yet, and that's why it's at the shop. Where do I find patterns? Oh, great question. And I should take a second here to move between the two accounts so I can do some typing. I've got some websites to recommend where one can find patterns. I also have a couple of books that I can recommend that give really detailed instructions with pictures and diagrams to show how to do this from the very beginning to a finished Tamari ball. Thanks for letting me back in on this one, and then I will go over to the chat here to paste in some websites that I can recommend. The first one here, Tamari Kai, is great for just a million inspirations of patterns that have been written by people who make Tamari. And so it's people sharing with each other designs that they've created. And it's just chock full of really colorful examples. And it's a great place to go for inspiration. And the second one that I've got here is Barb Cease's site, and her gallery has some really impressive advanced, kind of all over the ball patterns, ones that aren't just tied to the poles, and requires a lot of more measuring. And if you make the ball big enough, you need a lot of stitches to cover it. And the more sort of intersections that you can create with guidelines, the more flexibility you can have for the larger number of the same shapes in symmetry on the Tamari ball. Then I also wanted to show a couple of books that are in my library that I've really gotten a lot of mileage out of. This one, Tamari Techniques, is really detailed on a rather traditional way of starting a Tamari ball, and then how to put on the guidelines, how to do measurements for the more complicated patterns that are done with divisions, or sorry, with multiples of 10 in how many places that you're putting pins on the ball. And also had good luck with following the directions from this book. This is Margaret Ludlow's Tamari book. There's also another author who's pretty popular named Diana Vandervoort, and she has a lot of cool ideas on her website as well. And I'll go ahead and type in these names in case people want to. Now, these authors that I've got in the chat here are available in English. And if one wants to take up the challenge of using a pattern that's written in Japanese, but you basically, if you don't already know how to read Japanese, you can do the best you can with looking at the diagrams and the photographs. And there are, I've seen several sellers on Etsy, and there's also a Japan Temari Association member named Ai in Japan who sells the books that are published in Japan as well. Let's see. And then I should ask, are there any other questions perhaps on Facebook that I've missed?
I didn't get any questions on Facebook, but I did get someone saying thanks for the demonstration. They found it really interesting. I have a question actually. Do you have any other like partially completed Tamari that you would be willing to show us, sort of like in between stages?
I do. There's one right here, in fact. This design that I'm making is called Swirl, and I've started out with my guidelines not really being attached to a particular pole or another. This is an all-over design where I started out making guidelines much like this one, but then, or I should say I started out with putting the pins in as if I were making a simple division ball like this, but then according to specific measurements to line up, having intersections of lines that would create squares and hexagons. Then after getting those pins replaced to where those new corners were going to be, then I was able to stitch on the squares, and then doing that created the sides for the hexagon. And this style of stitching is really based on starting at the outside of a shape, taking a very small stitch with the needle and heading over to the other, the next corner, turning the ball, taking a small stitch again and heading over to the next corner. So you end up with a lot of layers of these kind of fan shapes get formed by doing that over and over. And then all the little fans start lining up to kind of spiraling toward the center. Have I ever done Tamari on a shape other than a ball? I have not, but that's just a personal preference. There are people who love making Tamari with egg-shaped forms. I think usually they start out with either a plastic form or a styrofoam form before wrapping on the soft yarn and then the sewing thread. And then the measuring, of course, works out entirely differently, where you are basically tied to starting with the North and South Pole, because an egg doesn't have exact symmetry all the way around it, not being a sphere. And one of the really popular patterns to use on eggs is it's entirely sort of OB based. I'm searching around in the bag here for one that I have of this style. This is a really tiny one. So one can use paper here underneath and stitching over top of it to make these rings. And that's a really popular one for people to do on eggs. What was your first Tamari and the hardest one? Let's see. I kept the first Tamari. This is a pattern that I needed to stop partway through because I realized that the number of rows of stitching around this intersection is supposed to be the same number so that each of these corners will meet. And it didn't happen that way because my ball wasn't perfectly spherical. So the very first Tamari, I fudged it in that I stopped with my rows of stitching such that these lines would be about an equal length. So it would sort of look like the squares are all the same size, but they're not. And that also, I think, probably was the hardest one because I was just for the first time doing everything. As far as other major challenges that I've set myself, probably the all over patterns are ones where I'm starting to get the hang of doing more of those and the measuring of them. And I'm really looking forward to making some more technically challenging designs with things sort of like the dividing the entire ball into many pentagons, and the starting out with that dividing into 10 and then further divisions so you get as many intersections as possible that are multiples of 10. That is the kind of the next level that I'm aiming toward. I can also hold a couple of examples of work that I happen to have here with me just to show you a couple of other types of patterns. This star pattern is really similar to the kiku in that the rows of stitching end up lining up from this point, and I went up from there, but instead of having another point in the center, I just drew the embroidery thread all the way over the pole and did the stitch symmetrical on the other side. And then around the obi, these diamonds, you can't really see because it's under the obi. I think I've probably got a better one for that. These types of diamond shapes can be really dressed up by crossing the layers of thread over top of each other and then stitching them down so they hold still. This is a good challenging type of a pattern too. And patterns to recommend for starting out. Yeah, I definitely would recommend this type of a pattern where you have intersections on the ball where you're doing a solid shape around them. You can do, you know, diamonds, squares, open shapes that are interlocking, those sorts of things. And it's not super challenging to measure out. So you can really get started stitching very quickly. And the chrysanthemum style that I just barely started here in the demo is another one that I often will show people in their very first lesson. And any others, Megan?
I just double checked Facebook, and I did not see any additional questions. If anybody does come up with any questions later on, I am happy to put my email in the chat. If you want to send them to me, I'm happy to get you an answer from Heather. So I'll go ahead and drop that.
Oh, I should also probably type in where to find me and my work online too. I'm a business called Hungry for Homemade, and I show my Tamari and cooking and other sorts of work on Facebook and on Instagram. Well, it's been really great this evening to share a little bit of thread art with you, and thanks so much for all the questions about it. And it's been wonderful being able to do this presentation without having to drive to Aurora. So thanks very much for setting this up virtually.
So thank you so much, Heather, for coming and doing this demonstration for us. Thanks everyone for attending. Like I said, this recording will be available on our social media sites for 30 days following the presentation. And like I said, I went ahead and dropped my email in the chat. Heather put her social media. Feel free to reach out to us if you have any other questions.
Or if you start being inspired to make Temari and you want to show me pictures, I would love to see those too. Thank you so much, everybody.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful evening.
Good night.